Now it is with great honor that I invite our keynote speaker and one of the founders of the Orality in Literacy conferences, Niall Slater, the Dobbs Professor of Latin and Greek in the Department of Classics at Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia, and Director of the Center for Language, Literature, and Culture. Professor Slater's research interests are the ancient theater and its archaeology, the ancient novel, gender studies, warfare and its cultural impacts, and classical reception. Among his numerous published studies, I will mention his book, Euripides, Alcestis, published in 2013 by Bloomsbury Publishing House, which explores the reception and afterlife of the play Alcestis and analyzes its main themes, the myth on which it builds, and its historical and social context. Another book, Spectator Politics, Meta-Theater and Performance in Aristophanes, published in 2002 by the University of Pennsylvania Press, uses a reception-based performance criticism to show that, besides aiming to entertain, Aristophanes employed meta-theater to teach his audience how to read and interpret performance in other public sites of the ancient Athenian democracy, such as the political assembly and the law courts. Professor Slater's translation of the Middle and New Comedy are included in the book, The Birth of Comedy, Texts, Documents, and Art from the Athenian Comic Competitions, 486 to 280 BC, which was published in 2011. Now, Professor Slater will talk to us this evening on textualization from the bottom up. Professor Slater, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you indeed. It is a great honor to be invited to kick off our 14th gathering of Orality and Literacy. I'd like to offer my profound personal thanks to the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities for hosting the first part of this conference, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for their hospitality to come. And I offer my special thanks to our wonderful organizers, Rachel Zelnick-Abramovitz, Margalit Finkelberg, whom I congratulate as well on her new election, and Donna Shalev for their extraordinary work in putting together this gathering, as you all know, under such challenging circumstances, and from which we will all benefit so much in the days to come. I hope my internet connection and other technicalities will hold up during this hour. So far, so good. So let me plunge into my topic for this evening. Throughout antiquity, the majority of the peoples of Greece and Rome lived in an oral world. Yet almost from the beginning of the introduction of alphabetic literacy, many must have been increasingly conscious of residing on the borders of that world of literacy. My goal here this evening is to explore some of the ways in which not just the technology of literacy, but forms of intextualization may have drawn new participants in. I have stated my theme as textualization from the bottom up, although perhaps at the beginning we should really think of it as textualization from the side view. Certainly at the earliest stages, the non-literate will not have seen themselves as at the bottom of a hierarchy. Many of the most elite can have seen little of interest or value in this new technology for their own purposes, at least at first, whether we accept the theory that the alphabet came in for the needs of trade, or are more intrigued by the possibility that early on it served what we would classify as more cultural and literary memorializations. Yet an interest in literacy and textuality certainly grew, not steadily, not in the same way in every local culture, and some of those variations I would like to explore with you. And I'd like to begin by exploring some simple texts from some of our earliest evidence for literacy, not in terms of questions of dating, but more for how textualization intrigued some of its very earliest practitioners. The inscriptions found on scratched on vases in recent decades at Methone have, of course, been keenly discussed in relation to dating the arrival of the alphabet in Greece and to the purposes of its introduction. Though it may seem terribly simple, I think it also worthwhile to consider the satisfactions these texts offer their authors, and perhaps their readers as well. One of the most basic looks initially like a simple claim of ownership, the speaking inscription that asserts a relationship between the object we see and its now long vanished owner. Here, for example, is all that's left of the cup of Philon and the graffito that he presumably scratched onto it. Yet at this early stage, and even on such a modest object, I think we can see more at work here than the mere assertion of possession. In his recent book on orality, textuality, and the Homeric epics, Jonathan Reedy draws on the increasingly influential work of the anthropologist Karen Barber on African oral cultures. In my own moment of entextualization by quotation, let me begin by citing Reedy, then citing Barber. First, Reedy. In her own discussions of entextualization, Barber begins by finding evidence for the desire to fix words in the practice of attaching oral texts to objects. And then Barber, oral texts in Africa are often actually attached to or secreted in material objects. The Lubu Lukasa board, Zulu messenger beads, and a host of other material repositories and memory prompts operate in different ways to transcend time, to fix or trap a text in material form. Moreover, as Barber elsewhere stresses, quote, the process of entextualization is ubiquitous in everyday life. It is not reserved for the production of monumental works of art. In what must have been a small society at Methone, ownership was already inscribed in social memory and practice without writing. Philon's words then do much more than claim possession. In the performance of using this cup, whether we call that performance setting a symposium yet or not, the inscription bespeaks Philon's literacy as well. Nikki Oikonomaki describes the operation of the Methone inscriptions thus, quote, the literate person needs a certain social context and addresses an audience which understands the literacy process and is familiar with such activities, either being able to read and write or not. The audience is not always able to read the written text, but it is in position to ascribe value to the literacy act. It is really tempting to approach this early formation of an identity both ways, as the earliest attempts of individuals to escape anonymity in a changing world, but also in literacy terms, as an attempt to seem and feel literate. Perhaps the most discussed of the finds at Methone is the cup of Hakasandros, which not only identifies itself by that relationship, but memorably threatens anyone who would attack that relationship. The text, of course, is lacunos, but the very plausible reconstruction is given here and suggests, I am, must be the cup of Hakasandros, and whoever takes me from him, of his money, his eyes, of something, he will be deprived. As a metrical inscription of such early date, this text has most often drawn comparison to the famous cup of Nestor from Pithecusae. But rather than embracing a textuality linked to epic poetry, Hakasandros' cup embodies a script of playful but feisty competition, even a form of a potential curse. Along with the more varied but recognizable genre of dedicatory inscriptions, such ownership inscriptions spread quickly throughout Greek regions along with the alphabet. So much so that Oikonomaki can justly describe this phenomenon as hyperlocal. Individuals who had very little need for writing otherwise were increasingly tempted to textualize themselves in these ways and to be seen as doing so. Jumping over a few centuries, we find some remarkable examples of embodied identity and competition in the Attic countryside, in shepherd's graffiti that Merle Langdon has been collecting and studying for the past few decades. While these are startling evidence for more than the most elementary functional literacy, where few would have expected any literacy at all, many exhibit an intriguing local transcript of identity. Some indeed record no more than names, but here is the basic version of the local type that says, metagenos emi mnema, I am the mnema of Metagenes. These are mnemata, memorials, reminders, which appear in happy profusion of orthograde here, retrograde inscriptions as Spoudios is here, and boustrophodon. Fairly compelling evidence, along with their letter forms, that Ergotimus and company are not later than the end of the 6th century, and perhaps significantly earlier. Unlike the mobile speaking ceramics earlier, these unmoving rocks contextualize not ownership, but personal memory. They speak as remembers of identity in life and for millennia thereafter. Not only that, they remember roles, actions, and perhaps loves. For Straton here, it is remembered as herding his sheep. But for Demomeles, he wants to localize himself as well as his sheep here, and thought, though perhaps both as Graffito does. Melanthros extends the formula, but adds a personal comment that may confuse speaker identity. His Graffito asserts, I say that I am the mnema of Melanthros, herding the sheep. But when it goes on to say, alas, boy, you're wearing me down, the move to second person address makes us, its readers, into eavesdroppers on a particular time in the life of Melanthros, a proto-drama remembered on the rock. Others promote the writer to the subject position, though there is no way to know if this form of Graffito is later than the versions with the mnema that speaks in its own person. So Timides, however, not only dramatizes his own situation by telling the other herdsman that he wrote his inscription, when he insists that he, a goat herd, now knows how to do this, he makes this knowledge part of his identity. Finally, this small world of textualization, of textual declarations and competition could involve attacks on the inscriptions themselves. Langdon records intentional defacement of some of these graffiti, while at least 2 include warnings against just such attacks. The mnema of Theseus both proclaims its identity and forbids attacks on itself, ap audo me diaphthere. Even more intriguingly, the danger was not simply erasure or destruction. Langdon notes that a few inscriptions that initially appeared to be nonsense, on closer examination, seem to include letters altered by extra strokes, rendering the whole unintelligible. In other words, such an attack could rewrite sense into nonsense, an unweaving of textuality for the deliberate destruction of both memory and identity embodied in the mnema. Such a world of competing texts existed and certainly developed in Athens and Roman cities as well. For 5th century Athens, we must put together scattered evidence from literary texts and the world of vase painting to discern some of these operations. The locus classicus for competitive graffiti writing appears in Aristophanes' wonderful play satirizing the Athenian court system, The Wasps. The slaves in the prologue to the play describe the fanatic old juryman Philocleon as so obsessed with the courts that when he sees a graffito written on a door praising Demos as Colossus, Demos is also known as recipient of Colossal Inscriptions on vases, Philocleon writes up next to it, Chemos Kalos, the funnel covering the voting urn is what's beautiful or hot to him. The culture of Colossal Inscriptions is, of course, best attested on Greek vases of the 6th and 5th centuries, but that disproportionate survival may make us think that the competition played out primarily in more private social spaces, such as the symposium. However, along with Philocleon's activities, this small sculptural fragment from the Acropolis Museum, somewhat clumsily squeezing Lysias Kalos into a corner here, shows that the practice claimed public space and monuments as well. Words were not the only graffiti in spaces public and private, and I cannot resist sharing with you one interesting detail I recently found on this particular vase. Here's the actual vase, and the corner of the scene turning here, we have a sketch. Of course, this artist may never have seen the interior of an elite women's quarters, but he decorates the double doors with a charming graffito of a woman's head in the same way that Philocleon inscribed his point of view on a public door. Even centuries later, Lucian depicts not only a continuing graffiti culture, but also the power of such texts to denounce as well as disagree. In Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans, the lectures of a philosopher, one of those dangerous types, have seduced a young man away from his relationship with a hetaira. She plots to get him back, as she tells a friend, by posting an anonymous graffito where her former lover will see it, denouncing the philosopher as a predator. Caledonian little Squallow tells her friend, I think I'll write it up on the wall in the Kerameikos, where Architeles, her former lover, often takes a walk. Aristaenetus is corrupting Clinias. Her friend Drosus, how can you write it up without being seen? By night, I'll get a bit of charcoal somewhere. Such displays of desires and denunciations enacted in public spaces continued into the Roman world. Examples, individual examples from Pompeii and elsewhere are too numerous to cite, but a passage from Plautus's The Merchant shows that such graffiti were already known and the subject of humor in the mid-Republican city. The old father in this play is explaining why he refuses to buy a beautiful enslaved woman to serve his wife. The problem would be she'd attract too much attention out in public. And especially the last line and a half here, occentent ostium. People would serenade the door, i.e. my door, with their pieces of charcoal. My door would be filled with elegies. This description hints at the temptations of more complex textualizations, with more accomplished writers and potential readers alike. And we shall return to such a scenario a little later on. For now, though, I would like to look at some further inflections of textualization in the hands of Greek vase painters. Almost all such writing is, of course, part of the painter's original design, applied before firing rather than incised afterwards, as were the graffiti we looked at right at the beginning. Yet these are not all the same kinds of texts, nor is the painter always, in some intriguing ways, their author. Specialists tend to classify writing on vases into 4 groups by apparent function. Signatures, both of painters and potters, tags or captions, mostly labeling animate figures, although early on, sometimes objects as well, The special category of colossal inscriptions we've already noted, and a more variable and much rarer group of bubble inscriptions that may represent speech or sound within the scenes represented. Signatures might seem a very obvious and natural category, but a couple of modest points should be made about the kinds of textualization they represent. These working artists may have had very little need to write other than in their work, and little more to read. Potter and painter may be different artists. Indeed, as workshops grew, potters seem to have been yours, employing multiple painters. Even when separate signatures for potter and painter appear, however, the hands suggest that the painter writes or paints both. Signatures certainly communicate a brand to potential buyers, but they do so most effectively then for a local audience. The Corinthian pottery industry reached for an export market well before Athens did, and thus relatively few Corinthian vases carry signatures. They were not an effective way to speak to an export audience. Rich ornamentation and abhorrence of empty space characterize the designs of Corinthian pottery. These aesthetics influence textualization in turn. Many note how tag inscriptions on these pots become part of the overall ornamentation. The angular letters both integrated into, but also providing pleasing contrast to other filler ornamentation. For the effect of the Corinthian style of labels, I show you here not a pot from Corinth, but one of the most famous Attic vases of the Corinthianizing style, with Heracles labeled tightly retrograde behind his back, and the centaur Nessos or Netos in this spelling in front, but where the filler ornamentation almost continues and is a part of the labels that we have here. More intriguingly, however, many labels on Corinthian vases employ a form of textualization rather different from what this and later Attic examples might lead us to expect. Many Corinthian figures carry what D.A. Amix classified as throwaway inscriptions. These inscriptions are quite readable, but short, often only two-syllable names drawn from a stock and repeated repertoire, naming men, women, and even horses, and sometimes naming multiple figures with the same name. They are real Greek names, but paradoxically, at least for us, the same as no name, in that they designate no known mythic or indeed historical individuals. An illiterate viewer may recognize them as name labels. For the functionally literate, these names can be sounded out, but communicate no useful information in the process. Apparently, for both artist and viewer at this stage, in this culture, it is a sufficient satisfaction to textualize the idea of naming, to offer a script for the performance of naming, but without the need to offer content. At the other end of the scale, however, Corinthian painting can turn text into its own performance on both verbal and visual levels. An outstanding example is this early 6th century Erybolos found at Corinth, portraying an aulos player and a dancer entangled in the text of their mutual performance. The piper is labeled Polyterpos. I give you this black and white from a slightly different angle for a better view. And his name, of course, means very pleasing. But this is most likely not his name, but rather an example of what Rudolf Wachter calls semi-throwaway labels. These are longer than other stock names, but often have prefixes such as eu, eru, or poly, but they are repeated over and over, again, probably not designating real individuals. The inscription flowing from his pipes both enacts and textualizes the performance of the dancing boy, purvias procoreuomenos auto de olpa, Pyrrhus leading the dance, and this is the olpa for him. Olpa, Attic olpe, seems to have been the local name for this very vase shape. We now conventionally call it an eribolus, but it is a perfume vessel notably used at the gymnasium. Excavated at the Temple of Apollo, this vase seems likely both to have commemorated the performance and functioned as a dedication in honor thereof. Moreover, the text here seems to elide performance into commemoration. It is apparently a hexameter verse, thus appropriate to the genre of the performance, but its words cannot have been part of Pyrrhus's original chorus. Rather, they look back on the performance from a perspective of its success. In its visual shape and metrical form, the inscription seeks to contextualize both original music and dance. But the words themselves instantiate the memory of the performance and affix it to an object for its perpetuation. Would it be too much to consider this single hexameter the first shape poem? From perhaps an excess of signification, let us turn to a curious form of textualization, best known from Athenian vase painting from the early 6th on into the 5th centuries, the so-called nonsense inscriptions. The term is perhaps unfortunate. This definition through negation, sign sequences that lack apparent sense, covers rather disparate phenomena. Initial approaches classified these merely as evidence of illiteracy. No doubt, some painters, visually attracted by the letter forms appearing in works of their competitors, tried their own hand at these without any understanding of what they represented. A black figure cup in the Louvre shows one version of this practice. The letters here below are well formed. Some of the sequence is even pronounceable with a sufficient scattering of vowels among the consonants, but in no way representing sounds or sequences at home in Greek. Other artists may have detected patterns in sequence, coming to produce inscriptions consisting of small groups of letters repeating, but with no discernible signification again, as in these labels on these musical figures from a black figure amphora here, this inscription transcribed here, and this repeated cluster of keio from both of them, but no signification. An early and at least partially plausible explanation for such inscriptions has been literacy envy. Painters saw what others were doing, detected a response from customers, some of whom must have been as illiterate as some of those painters, and went after that market as best they could. Henry Immerwahr's fundamental work on evidence for script, heavily on inscriptions from vases, showed that fully 1/3 of surviving inscribed vases from Attica include nonsense inscriptions, and a significant proportion of those display both sense and nonsense. If we examine this body of material strictly for evidence of levels of literacy, it is possible to construct scenarios that explain away contradictions implicit in the presence of both sense and nonsense on a single vase. The potter might provide the painters with models of his own signature to copy onto the product, or a customer might do the same when requesting a specific Colossal inscription on a commissioned vase. A deft painter could copy these quite accurately, and then on the same vase, use these and other letters to produce strings that look like labels purely for their visual appeal. Yet some painters whose body of work proves them to be quite literate still include nonsense inscriptions in their designs as well. Consider this black figure cup by Exekius, whose only decoration, apart from the black band, is inscription. One side here shows the signature of Exekius, Exekius Epoiesen. At a distance, the inscription on the other side looks to be a signature as well. Only closer up can the literate viewer detect that this is a pronounceable sequence of letters with a certain example, a certain resemblance to the standard Epoiesen. The artist made this, created this, but no discernible message in Greek. Is this Exekius's joke on an illiterate or uninterested customer? Or, as Alexandra Pappas has suggested, is it a joke that the cup's owner could play on another guest at a party by turning this inscription outward and challenging someone to read it? More puzzling is the case of this black figure amphora, one of whose sides displays a Trojan War scene with Hector and other combatants carefully and correctly named. The athletic scene on the other side, however, if examined from right to left, gives the first figure a good Attic name. Here is Hepposthenes with tau instead of the aspirated theta, but that's fine. The second, a pronounceable but totally unparalleled name of Uerpos. And the third, a string of letters that sounds like nothing imaginable in Greek. Immerwahr summed up his view of these inscriptions in this way, quote, "It is clear that we are dealing here with inscriptions that are a regular part of the vocabulary of ornamentation of Attic vases, and not with simple primitivism or lack of competence. The use of writing on vases serves to establish a connection between the pictorial world and the world of the logos, i.e. of conversation. Inscriptions show that the pictures in question, or the actions depicted in them, are worthy of being talked about. Thus, inscriptions increase the importance of the scenes to which they are attached, and nonsense inscriptions profit from the importance accorded to the written word." Invaluable and fundamental as Immerwahr's work has been, this does not really satisfy. The phenomenon is too widespread and lasts too long, fully explained as a solely visual interest on the part of producers and consumers alike. Sarah Chiarini's recent book on nonsense inscriptions sees them as arising, quote, "at a historical moment of great freedom and experimentation with the relatively new tool of writing, whose potentialities were still being investigated and tested. While some instances do show minimal or partial literacy, Chiarini offers the slightly counterintuitive hypothesis that the vases mixing sense and nonsense represent fully literate painters joining in a game begun by the non or partially literate. She suggests turning our gaze, quote, "from the creators to the viewers." By focusing on those who consume nonsense dipinti, it will be possible to see how these inscriptions could unleash a whole range of imaginative, logical, and linguistic skills in a literate reader. Even though the producers of such nonsense inscriptions were a tiny proportion of the Attic population, their audience was undoubtedly larger, and the games that could be played with these texts more varied than with the equally non-signifying throwaway inscriptions on earlier Corinthian pottery. Simple assertions of identity persist, but that identity and the very means of communication can now be parodied, remade, and even liberated from signification. Readers and writers alike were crossing the increasingly porous borders between orality and textuality for fun and profit. For my final section, we return to the Roman world. and one complex example of multiple textualizations that came together in Pompeii with remarkable results. Centuries of scholarship have shaped our reception of the wealth of material preserved at Pompeii. Much of it informed by modern views of graffiti that saw such material as evidence for semi-literate, lower-class speech at best and vandalism at worst. Now, some ancient elite evidence did point in this direction. One of Martial's splendidly nasty epigrams takes us to the mean Roman streets, imagining the writing of one such text. Martial is sneering at a man named Ligura, who pretends to be afraid that Martial will write about him, but clearly wants the fame of the poet's attention. Martial, in turn, pretends to refuse to write about him, but writing in an epigram to him, he directs Ligura to look for notoriety much further down the social scale. Here, these verses, Martial tells Ligura, "My advice, if you're struggling to be read about, look for a drunk poet of the dark alleyway who writes poems in crude charcoal and crumbling chalk for readers taking a crap." Recent work by Rudolf Wachter, Martin Langner, Rebecca Benefiel, Christina Milner, and others has examined how such graffiti came together in spaces both public and private, finding many kinds of dialogue among texts and between texts and their spatial settings. As our final example, let us look at a concatenation of verses, much discussed of late, enacting a dialogue of quotation, imitation, and what we might even term meta-textualization. Some, perhaps all, use others' words, though one or two may be compositions by their unknown inscribers. Their dialogue and interplay with persona invite us to think about the textualization of persona from the very beginning of writing on a surface meant to last. This group of 10 verses was cut to the plaque inside the entranceway to Pompeii's basilica. I show it to you here in the photograph from Milner's book with the script enhanced by overlay. The first 3 couplets initially attracted attention as quotations or misquotation of known elegiac texts. The last 2, one in iambic sonarii, the other also elegiac, are otherwise unknown. The most recent scholars to work on these disagree on how many different hands are at work in putting these together, from a single graffitist to as many as 5. Despite being no expert in Roman cursive hands, I am most intrigued by the idea of multiple writers. But in case that these enact a dialogue of persona seems generally agreed. The first 2 couplets from Ovid and Propertius accurately reflect the texts as we know them through the literary tradition. As Milner points out, both are already quotations within their original poems. Both give mercenary advice from an older woman figure, the Lena, to the young woman who is the object of the poet persona's desires, and are quoted as overheard by the poet. Ovid in his Emores overhears Dipsa saying, "Let your door be deaf to the beggar, wide open to the giver. Let the welcomed lover overhear the words of the one shut out." And from Propertius, "Let your porter be alert for the givers. If a pauper knocks, let the deaf doorman dream on against the bolted door." In their spatial context, at the entrance of a public building, Milner suggests these views, reinforcing each other, might even have a sarcastic political meaning. In the public space of Pompeii, admit only the rich and generous, exclude the poor and needy. The next lines, however, are both set off from the first 4 by a small gap, but clearly oriented to follow them. This couplet, slightly reworded or misquoted, comes from Ovid's ars amatoria, the art, his advice to aspiring lovers, and in many ways answers the cynicism of the first two couplets. Now, this is indeed a famous aphorism, quoted elsewhere, at least by Seneca, but here reworded more colloquially. What could be so hard as stone, rather than what we think is Ovid's original harder than stone, with the less common use of magis, quid magis ex saxo durum, to make dura comparative. The spelling of saxum in both cases is also the more popular phonetic spelling than we find in our standard text. In its original context, Ovid is reassuring his aspiring pupil that persistence pays off in spite of obstructions by enemy arrows, such as speak in the first four lines. Milner notes something else impossible to learn from previously published versions, that someone wrote the first three words of this couplet off to the left of the first four verses, but then the same hand inserted it underneath after a small gap. Here is her enhanced photograph, and it's black and white, and I know it's not great, but here's the quid potens are here that he starts writing below, and these are the faintest traces of those first four verses. But then you may have to take my word for it. Here is quid again in the same hand where it is now positioned. Although she draws a different conclusion, and I certainly have not examined the original plaster myself, this strongly suggests to me a different writer choosing how to respond to the first quotations. The couplet's colloquial variations also suggest someone working from memory. After another gap, we shift meter and thus genres as well. The next two lines have the form and vocabulary of Roman comedy, but we have no means to identify them with any known author. When the ham is cooked, if it's put before the guest, it doesn't taste like ham. He doesn't taste the ham, he licks the pot or the dish. The connection here is far from immediately obvious. While the first 6 verses most clearly resonate with the world of elegy, this comment on the dinner guest who misses the main point for the trimmings implies mockery and connects with Roman's comedy's obsession with pork luxuries, but is still rather disorienting for sequence of thought. Whom does this mockery target? Without yet trying to resolve that connection, let us turn to the final entry here, also an elegiac couplet, but notably not differentiating hexameter from pentameter visually, as did the first two couplets. Whoever's in love has no need for hot springs, for no one once burnt can love the flames. Here we return to the central subject matter of erotic elegy, and in rather obvious form. In fact, Wachter uses the variety of couplets beginning quisquis amat as one of his strong arguments for the existence of a popular oral poetry entextualized among the graffiti of Pompeii. If we look again at the whole sequence, some kind of dialogue between demonstrably different sources seems obvious. The question of who wrote them into the basilica wall, as well as when, is of course unanswerable. But exploring a couple of scenarios may lead to some further inferences about popular entextualization of both known and newly composed verse. At the risk of condensing her argument too radically, Milner seems to posit a single writer putting together all of these quotations based on structural and sonic echoes, as well as thematic similarities. She finds the result to be a miniature anthology with intriguing resemblances to Hellenistic epigram collections. An implicit possibility is that her single writer, coming to the basilica repeatedly, built up this little collection over time. More recently, Matthias Hanses discerning the simultaneously comic as well as elegiac associations of an exclusus amator scenario here, the aspiring lover shut out from his beloved's door, has suggested at least 3 different writers built up this story over time. He sees 2 different writers for the first 2 couplets and then a third contributing everything else. On the other hand, he also sees 3 characters at work here: the mercenary Lena, and then those brought in by his third, the persistent though hapless lover, and the purely comic character, the cynical slave, commenting on the situation. This construction of drama out of quotations seems to me very appealing. In particular, attributing these voices to different characters with different motivations accounts far better for the startling break in both form and tone contributed by the iambics. The third couplet could simply argue with the first 2 within the world of elegy, but that fourth couplet emphatically breaks in from the world of the stage. Given that sudden shift, I am inclined to see a new writer contributing the iambics, and perhaps yet another, the final couplet, whose sentiments may suit the lover, though not really at the same moment of plot development as the third couplet. Or perhaps they belong to another commentator figure. But time forbids any further discussion of details for now. One of the most famous graffiti found at Pompeii, found in at least 4 examples, offers mocking sympathy. To the wall, I'm amazed, wall, you haven't collapsed putting up with so many writers' wearisome words. Perhaps you all deserve such sympathy after enduring my long litany of examples, especially given the modesty of my conclusions, which are more an invitation to further exploration and a synthesis. Barber speaks of the textualizing impulse as seeking both to trap a text in material form and to transcend time. The impulse to textualize the self appears early and often in the work of these modest writers, whether as simple possessors, dedicators, or even passers-by. Some patterns are widespread, but local cultures, such as the shepherd's graffiti, may offer glimpses of lives otherwise completely unknown. Of equal interest to me is the impulse to play, whether in the curious fashion for nonsense inscriptions that flourishes for decades before vanishing completely, or in the stereotyped praises such as Colossal Inscriptions. Competition is never far from this impulse. It may be a long march from the competitive quotation of formulaic praises in the Colossal Inscriptions to competitive literary quotation, but the play continues with different game pieces. Visualizing textualization from the bottom up allows us to meet some very ordinary residents of the past, charcoal or stylus in hand, seeking for their moment to transcend time. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. I hope it works. Yeah, thank you.
Beautifully.
Now it will go. Thank you very much, Niall. I open the floor for questions from the audience here and questions and answers from those who are on Zoom. Any questions here? Yeah. Just a moment.
Hi, Niall. Can you see people in the crowd?
He cannot see you, but
I can't yet.
You go up there. Ah, really? Okay. All right. Should I come up here?
You can go.
Okay.
I think I recognize the voice even without the.
Hi, Niall.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Niall and I were graduate students together at Princeton. It was a fascinating lecture, Niall. Not at all tidy up that you offered us. I have a question about the nonsense, or the so-called nonsense, and the term that it has no, and the idea that it has no sense. Now, I don't know the scholarship on those inscriptions without identifiable words, and so whatever I may ask, say, or suggest might have already been asked, said, and suggested and shot down. So I hope that my question is not tidium. But I somehow, looking this way. I see, I'm looking here, okay. I'm looking at you, Niall.
I see you.
Even though I don't see you. My question is as follows. Nonsense means it has no sense. And it's difficult for me to believe that those letters were written without any intention of conveying some kind of sense or meaning. I thought the whole presentation was fascinating when your idea that this textualization of oral practice. So these texts, both with identifiable words and not identifiable words, are basically giving voice to what in text, what people were actually saying. So let's imagine they were actually saying or sounding out those words. They didn't have to be words like from the dictionary. And I could think of two realms. I don't have a complete interpretation. I've been thinking about this only since you've been talking about it. But I can think of two realms in which those so-called nonsense texts would have meaning. And that is the world of music or the world of magic. Just to say, make a comment on the second one, on the world of magic. You often find on funerary inscriptions, of course, the vases are not necessarily in funerary context, but in funerary inscriptions, you often find strings of letters, which are exactly that, they're strings of letters. Now, letters themselves have power. And these strings of letters in funerary contexts are often interpreted as having a kind of an apotropaic meaning or intention that is protecting the tomb. You showed at the beginning of your talk texts on objects whose intention was to protect the object. So I'm wondering whether, if we can imagine the authors or the authors imagining readers sounding out these texts, maybe singing a melody, as in sort of an ancient Greek la la la, or in the world of magic, whether those two, again, these are very vague questions, those two contexts might give meaning and make sense out of nonsense.
Thank you very much. And covering so many things, in justice, I must mention that Chiarini has explored a little of that. One of the challenges, I think, is that we find among a fairly large number of nonsense inscriptions, I'll continue to use the term even though it has its problems, relatively few examples that might fit comfortably into that notion. The notion that they might be encoded as music, I showed you the vase with the lyre players there. Attempts have been made, not on that vase, but others, to maybe even decode them into musical notes, although our evidence for even letters representing musical notes is, of course, centuries later than any of these vases. So is it an individual vase painter's interpretation of what the music might have sounded like? That certainly deserves to be explored. The notion that it might represent magical language has been suggested as well. And Chiarini even has a very small category where she wants to explore the notion where nonsense inscriptions appear in scenes with divine characters, that they might represent the imagination of what a divine language might be as opposed to a human one. And I think those are all tracks worth following, or at least considering. The challenge is that, again, the number of examples that would fit one of those patterns. So again, back to the lyre players vase, that KEO appears on a few other vases within that painter's workshop, and I think within that painter's work and within others from his workshop, but is not widespread. So It's a form of intextualization, yes, but probably not with a pattern that was widespread. And I think that still leaves in place the puzzle of why a vase painter such as Exekias, who can write very good inscriptions and use them flexibly in other ways, chooses to include one on his vase. Is it a challenge for the reader? What I've come to doubt from Invervar's notions, and again, it's very great work and it's very important, is that it's just enough to represent the notion of speech and conversation, and then draw us in simply on a visual basis. But those are all good things that continue to need to be explored, keeping in mind this interface on the vases where we have some very good text and some really hard to understand text. Maybe just say at the end, I take your notion that it's only I would think at a relatively early stage that a few vase painters you can see are they're tumbling letter forms around in the space as though they are like ornamentation, as though it's not really any different from a rosette. And at that point, it probably is not representing text as we can think of text. But then we get these strings, and that's what I'm challenged by. But thank you.
Yeah, Deborah, would you like to come here? Okay. In a minute, you'll see her.
That was my head that just walked. Hello, I'm so happy to see you, except that you're a camera and not a person, because I'm looking where I'm
sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
That was super fun. Before I get to my question, which is about something else, I absolutely love that Aribalos. That is my new favorite thing. But my question is about something else. My question is about audience in relation to a subset of the textualized objects that you're talking about. The first few, especially I was thinking about the stones that the shepherds inscribed. So on the one hand, clearly there's a sort of an idea of you're imbuing the object with the capacity to actually remember you by writing that. But in relation to that, and also to some extent in relation to the cup, I also wonder if there's a sense in which you are kind of, I don't know, performing yourself as a person who understands and comprises, masters writing, textualization. How do you think about audience for these objects that are at the opposite end of the spectrum from Pompeii, which obviously has gazillions of people seeing it all the time, and similarly with the things you talked about from cities? What about these little objects where, in the case of the shepherds, maybe nobody literally is ever going to see it? How do you envision or think about audience, and or do you think that there's an element of just the person kind of performing themselves in a certain sense by creating these inscriptions?
I think that's absolutely a very important component of those. As Langdon notes, as even a little bit of thought will tell us, we can't radiocarbon date or even stylistically date these into a sequence. And I may have created a quite fictive sequence by going from simple sayings of I am the mnema of X to slightly more complex presentations. But that one where the writer asserts not only that he knows how to write, that this is his mnema and that he knows how to write, is probably in many senses a performance as much for himself as for any other audience. The existence of these things hasn't been noted for the last 2,500 years, really. I mean, one or two have been found before, but it's Merle Langdon's amazing dedication to going out and walking the countryside around these particular settlements where there are a lot of rock faces, and has found these, which you have to look for. I mean, they're scratched with relatively simple force and tools, so they're not deep engravings, and you have to catch them almost in the right light to be able to see them. So yes, in a way, perhaps you are, or we could think that as they get a little more complex, they are as much a performance for the person himself. So far, only men testified to in writing these inscriptions and out shepherding the flocks there, as it is even for the other shepherds. But there must be some interaction, or you wouldn't have the defacement problem and the need to warn against defacement. So yeah, I think on the scale here, the performance is more self-oriented than some others. And then at what point does it cease to be? Because we don't seem to find, or at least Langdon hasn't found, inscriptions in significantly later letter forms that would push us down into the 5th and 4th centuries. It was no longer a performance apparently worth doing.
Thank you. We have one question. Athenodora asks, I'm thinking, oh, she comments, I'm reading it for you, to you, Niall. I'm thinking of those fairly popular posts in social media showcasing people with tattoos in foreign scripts that were misspelled, sorry, I cannot see very well, apparently by accident. They'd indicate the pleasure of being able to mock someone else's embarrassing mistake is a popular one. Do we hear of that kind of mockery in antiquity? Do we hear people treating spelling mistakes as something particularly embarrassing and mockery worthy?
Lovely question. I'll connect it in two ways. I think that when if we formulate it as the spelling accident, or as, for example, my example right near the end, spelling saxum with an extra S, you hear of bits of that in Aulus Gellius, people criticizing other people's spelling or pronunciation, which is perhaps closer to that. But early on, maybe it does connect to that notion of, so I can't give you anything early on in the history of the alphabet that's quite exactly like that, in part because we have alphabets not completely agreed. But going back to that cup of Ezekias, that notion that an inscription looks like something, and Pappas and some others have played with the notion that at the symposium, and Chiarini criticizes this, but I won't get into the details of that you're close enough to see the inscription painted on the other side that looks like an epoiesin, and somebody who's really marginally literate is trying to make it out and may recognize epoiesin or things that look like epoiesin just from the visual pattern, is trying to figure out if there's a name in front of that. And that's a little bit of a joke. It's a slightly mean joke. It's a possibility. And a few of the others have been categorized in that way. I'll just note that one of the interesting controversies now is whether we should embed all of these vase inscriptions, or nearly all of them, in the format of the symposium, which has been an intriguing idea from early on. On the other hand, some critics have pointed out that the survival of vases that could be linked to the symposium is remarkably high in the corpus of what's inscribed to begin with. So it may be a circular argument to say that what we have on vases belongs in the symposium, and primarily in the symposium. But I think there is that possibility that some of these inscriptions are meant to be a joke on the reader. Possibly in that spelling thing, but not as a pattern we can definitely associate a lot of examples with.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question from Ruth. She will come to the microphone and you can see her.
Thank you so much, Niall. I have rarely, I think, learned quite so much in so short a time. What's fascinating me, and I don't know if I can articulate it as a clear question, is the movement from so many of the very early inscriptions you talk about, which are very much about self-assertion. I particularly like the goat herd, because he's socially below even the shepherds and is clearly sort of trying to get his own back, whether they ever read it or not. But then we have things like Colossal Inscriptions, which are not signed. I think of, you see Demos Kalos and you write, well, the funnel is beautiful. But you've now said that in public, but it's not yours anymore. The point of writing there is the possibility of speech that is completely severed from the speaker. And I just don't know how to think about that. And I'm wondering if you do.
It's something I've thought about. Sorry, was there another voice or? Okay. As you may kindly remember, and thank you for the thoughts here, I tried to talk about Colossal Inscriptions at one of these previous meetings. I've come to be more sensitive to the fact that our survival of that material is almost totally from the vases, where they have to be included in the design before the firing, and where perhaps the notion of signing a point of view is not apposite. It's certainly possible, but may not occur to someone putting that on the vase, if indeed we go back to the notion. I think there's still general validity to it, that a colossal inscription on a vase in the symposium is a prompt to discuss this proposition at the symposium, but also a prompt to discuss it in public place. What we don't have, because fortunately for them, maybe not for us, no Greek city was ever buried by a volcano. We don't have a selection of those inscriptions from public places. We have a couple literary testimonia to the notion. And in Lucian imagined dialogue, it's important to be anonymous when it's the opposite of a Colossus inscription to say that the philosopher is corrupting young people. Maybe Colossus inscriptions existed in public spaces that gave a point of view, that had an ownership. It's harder to imagine. I think that other points of view outside of that particular inscriptional practice may have given a signed point of view, but anonymity is something that I certainly want to think about a lot more in relation to this culture of inscriptions in general. There are very few that are signed. One of the things that Milner does is compare that series of couplets, that little collection, with some verses that have been assigned a signature from theater in Pompeii, although she will actually argue that most of them are not written by that person who signs. So that kind of signature, except when you're doing an election poster or warning somebody about, warning the public about somebody who doesn't either or whatever, is less common. And I just thank you for inviting me to think more about how anonymity works in these after the age of And the age of assertion, I didn't give any examples, but of course there are plenty of Pompeii of somebody who says, I'm here and I'm doing this, but not from that point of view. That's interesting.
Thank you very much. We have another question from out there, from Christopher Haddad. Hello there, he says, great keynote. I have an example of spelling error that may be interesting. All the best, Christopher. Now, he writes further, the testimonium of Strabo 14:141, and I quote, and there is also a bronze statue of him in this theater with the inscription, surely this is a beautiful thing to listen to a singer, such as this man is, like unto the gods in voice, Aude. But the engraver, missing his guess, left out the last letter of the second verse, the iota of Aude. The base of the statue not being wide enough for its inclusion, so that he laid the city open to the charge of ignorance because of the ambiguity of the writing as to whether the last word should be taken as in the nominative case or in the dative. That means Aude versus Audei. For many write the dative case without the iota and even reject the ordinary usage as being without natural cause, unquote. And this is a translation from the Lab.
Thank you. Yes, that's a fascinating example. That does strike me as something from very much a literate age, much closer to Aulus Gellius than some earlier things about criticism for spelling and the elite's ability to make fun of those who just ran out of space. This joke has probably long since come and gone, but there used to be a sign that said plan ahead with the ahead sloping down at the end because it was too much space for the space there. And this is the same, this is a version of the same joke here. So yes, I think in a very literate age, one becomes, or for the elite who are very literate, I would subscribe to the notion that there's probably never above a 50% literacy rate at large, but one can make jokes about this at a later period. And so I'm very grateful to have that example. It's hard to place it at an earlier period, though they will criticize variations of regional spelling. I don't know why I suddenly want to throw this in, but I think I read a fascinating article as well about the regional alphabets, the local scripts as they're called, and the notion that in Panhellenic sanctuaries, using those was part of asserting a kind of city identity against other cities in competition, rather than agreeing to a universalized script. And I think that's a thought worth challenging, which later generations might have misunderstood as misspellings, as whether you could spell out a without writing the iota subscript or adscript. But sorry, just had to throw that in. But thank you for the example.
Any more questions? Okay, so we thank you very much, Niall, for this fascinating talk. And we are very sad that you are not here with us, but maybe next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed.